Look at this photograph. Really look at it. It's July 1949, somewhere in England. The sun is bright, the grass is perfectly manicured, and a formal military ceremony is unfolding with clockwork precision. Women in crisp khaki uniforms stand in perfect formation, shoulders back, chins up, eyes forward. They are members of the Women's Royal Army Corps, the WRAC, and this is their moment to shine before royalty. Princess Elizabeth, not yet Queen, walks along the line of soldiers, inspecting the Guard of Honor. She's 23 years old, elegant in her tailored suit and hat, moving with the practiced grace of someone born into ceremony. Behind her, officers in dress uniforms follow at the proper distance. The crowd watches in respectful silence. Everything looks exactly as it should, except for one thing. On the ground, directly in front of the princess, lies a woman, a soldier in full uniform, collapsed flat on her back on the grass, arms at her sides, completely motionless. She looks like a fallen statue, a figure removed from the careful choreography around her. And here's what makes this image impossible to forget. No one has stopped. The princess continues her inspection, walking past the fallen soldier without breaking stride. The other women in formation remain frozen at attention, staring straight ahead as if their comrade lying at their feet simply doesn't exist. The officers behind the princess don't pause. The ceremony goes on. This is not a photograph of an accident interrupted. This is a photograph of an accident ignored. Her name was Private Helen Carter. 21 years old, daughter of a factory worker from Manchester. She'd joined the WRAC 6 months earlier, one of thousands of women who enlisted in the years after World War II ended. For Helen, the military represented something revolutionary. A chance to serve her country not as a nurse or secretary, but as a soldier. Equal pay, equal training, equal respect, or so the recruitment posters promised. The reality was different. Women in the WRAC faced impossible standards. They had to prove every single day that they were just as tough as men, just as disciplined, just as capable of enduring discomfort without complaint. They couldn't show weakness. They couldn't ask for accommodations. They couldn't be emotional. Because if they failed, if they showed any sign of being less capable, it wouldn't just reflect on them individually. It would confirm what so many people already believed, that women didn't belong in the military at all. So when Princess Elizabeth came to inspect the Guard of Honor that July morning, Helen Carter stood at attention with her unit for 2 hours before the ceremony even began. 2 hours of standing completely still in the summer heat, knees locked, back straight, barely breathing. The heavy wool uniform trapped heat against her skin. Sweat ran down her spine. Her feet began to go numb. She'd been taught what to do if she felt faint. Unlock your knees, shift your weight slightly, keep blood flowing to your brain. But she'd also been taught something else. Don't move during inspection. Not an inch. Not for any reason. So Helen stood perfectly still, and she tried not to notice the tunnel vision creeping in from the edges. The way sound seemed to come from very far away. The weakness in her legs, that had nothing to do with muscles and everything to do with blood, no longer reaching her brain. And then the princess was there. 10 feet away, 9 feet, 8. Helen could see her now, this young woman who would someday be queen, moving down the line with that slight, practiced smile. In another life, they might have been friends. They were almost the same age. 7 feet, 6 feet, 5. The world tilted. Helen's last conscious thought was a surge of absolute horror. I'm going to ruin everything. Then her knees buckled, and she went down. Somewhere in the crowd, someone gasped. But the ceremony didn't stop. Because there were rules about this. Strict rules. If a soldier faints during inspection, the formation does not break. The ceremony does not pause. The princess does not acknowledge the incident, because to do so would be to suggest that something has gone wrong, and royal ceremonies do not go wrong. So Princess Elizabeth continued walking. She passed within inches of Helen's motionless body, her eyes fixed forward, her expression serene. The protocol demanded it. The protocol was more important than one woman lying unconscious on the ground. Behind the formation, medical personnel were already moving. They'd been positioned there for exactly this reason, because fainting during long ceremonies was common enough that they planned for it. But they couldn't break ranks until the princess had passed. Protocol again. For 90 seconds, Helen Carter lay on the grass while dozens of people walked past her, looked at her, stepped around her, and continued the ceremony as if she wasn't there. When the medics finally reached her, her pulse was weak and her skin was cold. They carried her away on a stretcher while the inspection continued. The other soldiers didn't turn their heads. They'd been trained for this. Helen regained consciousness in the medical tent 10 minutes later. Her first words were an apology. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the nurse. "I didn't mean to fall. I tried to stay standing. I'm so sorry." The nurse, an older woman who'd served through the war, looked at her with something between pity and anger. "You stood for 2 hours in wool uniform in July heat with your knees locked. Your body shut down because you were killing yourself to look perfect. And the first thing you do when you wake up is apologize." Helen started to cry, not from pain or fear, but from shame. She had failed. She had been weak. She had embarrassed herself, her unit, maybe even the princess. She had proved all the doubters right. "I should have been stronger," she said. "No," the nurse said quietly. "The system should have been kinder." But the system wasn't kind. The photograph that captured Helen's collapse was published in newspapers across Britain the next day. Not as a story about dangerous training practices or impossible standards, but as a quirky human interest piece. "Soldier faints during royal inspection," the headlines read, accompanied by the image of her body on the grass while the princess walked past. Some papers played it for laughs. Some focused on Helen's embarrassment. None asked why a healthy 21-year-old woman had been standing in conditions that shut down her brain. None questioned why protocol demanded that she be ignored while unconscious. None wondered what it said about the military that this was considered normal. Helen recovered physically within hours. The psychological damage took longer. She requested a transfer to a different unit, somewhere she wouldn't be the girl who fainted in front of the princess. The request was denied. For the remaining 18 months of her service, she was defined by those 90 seconds on the ground. When she left the military in 1951, she told the exit interviewer that she'd joined to prove women were just as strong as men. "And did you?" the interviewer asked. Helen looked at him for a long moment. "No," she finally said. "I proved we're just as human. But apparently, that wasn't what you wanted." The photograph remains. Princess Elizabeth, elegant and composed, continuing her inspection. The soldier behind her, standing perfectly still. And Helen Carter on the ground between them, fallen and ignored, visible and invisible at once. Look at it again. Look at how none of the other women in formation have moved. Look at how trained they are to pretend nothing is wrong. Look at how natural it appears, this scene of collective denial. And ask yourself, how many women are still standing perfectly still right now, feeling their vision narrow, refusing to fall because they've been taught that falling means failure. The photograph was taken 76 years ago. The question feels frighteningly modern. 3 weeks after this photograph was published, Private Helen Carter walked into her commander's office and formally reported that the fainting episode had left her with lasting vertigo and panic attacks. The military medical board ruled that she was exaggerating her symptoms to avoid duty. They never examined her. Ceremonial perfection is a myth built on thousands of trembling legs. For 3 days after Helen's collapse, the barracks at Queen Elizabeth Barracks felt smaller, the walls closing in with unspoken dread. The WARAC returned to normal operations, as if nothing unusual had happened. But beneath those perfectly aligned ranks, every soldier felt the shockwave of her fall. The next morning, Helen sat alone at the far end of the mess hall, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate without eating. Her face was pale, shadows carved deep beneath her eyes. She'd barely slept. Every time she closed them, she was back on the grass, staring up at the sky while boots marched past her head. Across the room, whispers rippled through clusters of women hunched over tea and toast. Not judgment exactly, but something worse. Recognition. Private Williams gripped her fork too tightly, knuckles white. Corporal Singh stared into her cup as if reading tea leaves that told only bad fortunes. Sergeant Price excused herself early, claiming a headache no one believed. They were all thinking the same thing. Could I be next? The question gnawed through layers of pride and protocol, burrowing into the soft places where doubt lived. In the RAC, weakness was contagious. If one woman fell, it suggested that all of them might. If Helen, who'd passed every fitness test, who'd stood through longer parades in worse heat, could go down, then what hope did the rest of them have? No one dared voice it out loud. Speaking fear made it real. By 600 hours, training resumed as scheduled. Parade rehearsal on the main drill square, weapons inspection in the armory, field exercises in full kit under a sun that climbed higher and meaner with each passing hour. The commanding officer, Captain Margaret Thornton, stood at attention before the assembled ranks, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You have a duty to your country and to your queen," she announced, scanning the rows of faces with the practiced eye of someone who could spot doubt at 50 paces. "The world is watching, and you must not fail. The RAC is not an auxiliary force anymore. We are full members of His Majesty's Armed Forces, subject to all sections of the Army Act. That means we are held to the same standard as our male counterparts. Not lower, the same." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. When you stand in formation, you represent every woman who has ever wanted to serve. You represent every girl who dreams of wearing this uniform. And you represent every man who doubts that you belong here. So when I say you cannot fail, I don't mean you personally. I mean all of us. Together. Do you understand? "Yes, ma'am." The response came in unison, sharp and loud, designed to drown out the tremor underneath. Helen forced herself back into formation that afternoon, despite the medical officer's suggestion that she take another day of rest. Rest was for those who could afford it. Rest was for civilians. She pulled on her uniform with hands that shook slightly, buttoned the heavy wool jacket despite the heat, and laced her boots with the kind of deliberate care that suggested she was trying to tie down something that wanted to escape. "Don't let what happened to me break the line," she whispered to herself, checking her reflection in the barracks mirror. The woman staring back looked hollow, older than her 21 years. As the minutes crawled by during afternoon drill, knees locked, back straight, eyes forward, she tasted bile in her throat. Her vision swam at the edges. She counted breaths. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. A trick someone had taught her. A trick that didn't work. She realized with creeping horror that discipline and desperation felt exactly the same. The stories behind the uniforms were never told. If you looked at the line of women standing at attention, you saw symmetry, order, identical faces beneath identical caps. But inside those skulls, chaos reigned. Private William's husband was missing somewhere in Malaya, where British forces were fighting communist insurgents in dense jungle. She'd received one letter in 3 months. It said nothing useful, just that he was alive as of 6 weeks ago. She stood at attention and wondered if he was still alive now, if she would be notified, if anyone would care that she'd spent her morning drilling when she could have been crying. Corporal Singh's parents had stopped writing after she enlisted. Her father, a shopkeeper in Birmingham, had made his position clear. Decent girls didn't join the army. Soldiers were for men. Women who wore uniforms were looking for trouble, which was his polite way of saying something much uglier. She stood at attention and tried not to think about the return address on letters she no longer received. Sergeant Price hid tremors in her hands that only appeared when no one was looking. A legacy of something that happened during the war, something she never discussed. She'd been ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, which became the RAC when Parliament decided women deserved to be full soldiers instead of volunteers. She'd seen things in France after D-Day that made standing still in the heat seem easy. But lately, the tremors were getting worse. She stood at attention and gripped her rifle so hard her fingers went numb, because if she let go, everyone would see her hands shake. The parade ground demanded silence, but inside their heads, the noise was constant. Protocol left no room for care. When Helen returned to full duty 3 days after her collapse, she was met not with comfort or concern, but with extra drills. "To prove you're ready," her superior officer explained, as if Helen had requested the punishment. "To show you belong." Helen recited the rules silently as she marched. Never move during inspection. Never ask to sit down. Never show weakness. Never be the reason they say women can't handle the job. The more she tried to erase her humiliation, the more it stuck to her like tar. Her name became shorthand for failure. "Don't pull a Carter," someone joked during a water break, and the laughter that followed was nervous, uncertain, designed to put distance between the speaker and the possibility of falling. But the worst punishment wasn't the extra drills or the whispers or even the exhaustion that made her bones ache. The worst punishment was solitude. At night, in the barracks, her bunkmates whispered around her as if she'd brought some invisible plague. Conversation stopped when she approached. No one asked if she was okay, because asking meant acknowledging that something was wrong, and acknowledging that something was wrong meant admitting that it could happen to them too. Helen lay in her narrow cot and replayed the moment of collapse until it blurred with nightmares of falling forever, of standing before the princess and having her knees turn to water, of opening her mouth to apologize and finding no words would come. Her letter home remained unfinished on the small table beside her bed. The pen dried out from lack of use. No words could explain what she'd lost. There was talk, briefly, of writing a formal complaint. Late one night, a group gathered in the corner of the barracks, voices low and urgent. Private Williams argued that medical support was insufficient, that standing for 2 hours without movement in wool uniforms in July heat was dangerous. Corporal Singh pointed out that men's units had water breaks during long ceremonies. Sergeant Price suggested carefully that maybe expectations were inhuman. The conversation died the moment a sergeant entered the room to conduct evening inspection. In the Army, even suffering must stand at attention. The next ceremony came quickly, too quickly. Another inspection, another royal visit, another test of nerves and heat and the body's capacity to betray you. This time, it was Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, inspecting units in preparation for some larger event Helen hadn't bothered to understand. The details didn't matter. The requirements were the same. Helen knew what was expected. Stand straight, smile if appropriate. Pretend the ground beneath your feet is solid as stone, even when it feels like water. As the band began to play, she locked her knees and stared at the back of the head in front of her. The sun beat down. Sweat trickled between her shoulder blades. Her vision tunneled slightly at the edges, and she counted breaths. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and waited for her body to decide whether it would obey her this time. Beside her, she heard someone's breath hitch. A tiny sound, barely audible over the music. She couldn't turn her head to see who it was, but she knew. They all knew. Another woman fighting the same battle, wondering if today would be the day she fell. A single thought echoed through the ranks, unspoken but deafening. How many more women would have to fall before anyone noticed? Before anyone asked why the ceremonies demanded more than bodies could give? Before someone in charge decided that maybe, just maybe, protocol wasn't worth this cost? The answer, for now, was silence. The band played on. The sun climbed higher. And in the second row, third from the left, someone's knees began to buckle. Helen never saw who fell that day. By the time the medics carried the woman away, the parade had already resumed. Princess Elizabeth never spoke publicly about the woman who collapsed at her feet that July morning. But those who served in her household whispered about what happened afterward, in the private rooms where royalty removed their masks. She returned to her apartments at Clarence House shortly after the inspection ended, her lady-in-waiting trailing 3 steps behind, as protocol demanded. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across Persian rugs and gilded furniture. Elizabeth sat at her dressing table and began removing the hat pins that secured her formal headpiece, each movement precise and practiced. "Your Royal Highness performed admirably," her lady-in-waiting offered, the kind of compliment that filled silence without risking substance. Elizabeth met her reflection in the mirror. Her face, still young at 23, showed none of the thoughts churning beneath the practiced composure. She'd been trained since childhood never to react, never to break ceremony, never to suggest that anything, no matter how shocking or disturbing, had penetrated the armor of royal duty. "The girl who fell," Elizabeth said quietly. "Has anyone checked on her condition?" The lady-in-waiting hesitated. "I believe the medical staff attended to her immediately, ma'am." "That wasn't what I asked." A pause. "I will make inquiries." Elizabeth turned from the mirror. "Do you know what they told me when I was preparing for these inspections? They said that soldiers sometimes faint, that it's common during long ceremonies, that the proper response is to continue as if nothing has happened, because acknowledging the incident would embarrass the fallen soldier and disrupt the dignity of the occasion. That is the tradition, ma'am." Tradition. Elizabeth tasted the word, found it bitter. "I walked past a woman lying unconscious on the ground, and tradition says that was the correct thing to do. The kind thing, even. Because stopping would have made it worse somehow. With respect, ma'am, you followed protocol perfectly. No one could fault. I'm not worried about fault." Elizabeth stood, crossing to the window that overlooked the gardens. "I'm worried about what we're asking of those women. The rack girls are told they must meet the same standards as men. Stand as long, endure as much, show no weakness. And when their bodies betray them, not through lack of courage or discipline, but through simple human limits, we pretend they don't exist." The lady-in-waiting said nothing. Royal observations that questioned tradition rarely invited response. Elizabeth pressed her palm against the cool glass. My grandmother told me something once. She said that being royal means carrying the weight of centuries, that every action must honor those who came before and set an example for those who follow. But she also said that sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to break with the past. What will you do, ma'am? I don't know. Honest admission, rare from someone whose every word was usually measured and diplomatic. But I cannot shake the image of that woman lying there while I walked past her. While everyone walked past her, as if she'd ceased to be human the moment she fell. That evening, Elizabeth made inquiries through unofficial channels, the kind of careful, discreet questions that never appeared in official records, but circulated through the networks of servants and secretaries who actually ran the machinery of royal life. She learned Helen Carter's name. She learned about the medical officer's dismissal of her vertigo and panic attacks. She learned that the WRIC had neither investigated the incident nor made any changes to their ceremonial procedures. She learned, in other words, that one woman's collapse meant nothing to an institution that valued appearances over welfare. 3 weeks later, Elizabeth attended another military inspection, this time of a men's unit stationed at Windsor. The day was cooler, the ceremony shorter. No one fainted. But as she walked the ranks, she found herself looking for signs of strain. Locked knees, pale faces, hands trembling just slightly at soldiers' sides. She saw them everywhere. After the ceremony, she requested a private meeting with the commanding officer, a colonel who'd served since before the war. The conversation was brief and carefully worded, as all conversations involving royalty must be. She asked about water breaks during long ceremonies, about the medical protocols for soldiers who showed signs of heat exhaustion, about whether the standards being applied to the women's corps might be, perhaps, excessive given the physical differences between male and female physiology. The colonel listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a well-meaning amateur. "Your Royal Highness is very kind to concern herself with such matters," he said, his tone conveying exactly what he thought of that kindness. "But I assure you, the standards exist for good reason. If we begin making exceptions, where does it end? How can we maintain discipline if we coddle those who cannot meet the requirements? I'm not suggesting we coddle anyone, Colonel. I'm suggesting we question whether requiring someone to stand motionless for 2 hours in heavy wool in July heat is reasonable. With respect, ma'am, reasonableness is not the point. Military service is inherently unreasonable. We ask men, and now women, to risk their lives, to endure discomfort, to suppress their own needs for the greater good. That is the nature of service. And when that service kills them, when a young woman suffers lasting trauma because we refuse to acknowledge basic human limits." The colonel's expression hardened. If she cannot endure the demands, perhaps she should not have enlisted. Elizabeth left the meeting understanding something she'd suspected but never quite articulated. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as designed. The cruelty wasn't a bug. It was a feature. Traditions that harmed people weren't accidents of history. They were the intentional architecture of institutions that valued conformity over compassion. She also understood, with creeping resignation, that she was powerless to change it. Despite her title, despite her proximity to the throne, despite being daughter to the king, she remained a woman in a world run by men like that colonel. A decorative figure whose job was to smile, wave, and embody tradition without questioning it. The photograph from that July inspection was published in newspapers across Britain. Elizabeth had seen it. The perfect composition, the orderly ranks, her own serene face as she passed the fallen soldier. The papers called it a picture of grace under pressure. No one mentioned Helen Carter. No one asked why a young woman had been lying on the ground. The photograph became proof of the system's perfection. Look how smoothly everything continued, how minimal the disruption. Perfection built on erasure. Months passed. Elizabeth's life filled with the endless obligations of royalty, christenings and charity galas, ribbon cuttings and regimental dinners, the endless performance of being perpetually pleased with everything while never being permitted to change anything. But sometimes, late at night when the palace was quiet and she sat alone with her private thoughts, she returned to that moment. The woman on the ground, the choice to keep walking, the way everyone, herself included, had conspired to pretend that nothing was wrong. And she wondered, if she ever became queen, would she have the courage to break the traditions that broke people? Or would the weight of the crown simply crush whatever rebellious instincts she still possessed? She didn't know. But she knew one thing with certainty. The system would never volunteer to change. It would require force. It would require someone willing to stand against centuries of precedent and say, loudly enough that no one could ignore it, "This is wrong." In 1952, Elizabeth's father died, and she became queen at 25. She inherited the throne, the traditions, and all the machinery that kept young women lying on the ground while royalty walked past. The first military inspection of her reign was scheduled for June. On the morning of that inspection, Queen Elizabeth II stood before her mirror and made a decision that would never appear in any official history. But 3 women noticed what she did during the ceremony. And they told other women. And those women told others. Sometimes revolution begins not with declarations, but with small acts of defiance that no one was supposed to see. June 15, 1952. 4 months after becoming queen, Elizabeth stood before the mirror in her private dressing room at Buckingham Palace, preparing for her first major military inspection as monarch. The coronation itself was still a year away. June 1953, they decided, to allow time for mourning and preparation. But military duties couldn't wait. Her lady-in-waiting fastened the last button on her crisp naval uniform. Outside, hundreds of WRAC soldiers waited in formation on the palace grounds, their backs straight, their faces composed. Among them was Helen Carter, who'd been pulled back into service for this historic occasion despite everything that had happened. Because in the military, your trauma didn't excuse you from duty. It just made duty harder to bear. Elizabeth turned from the mirror. "What's the weather?" "Warm, ma'am. Quite humid. The forecast suggests it may reach 28 degrees by midday." 28 degrees Celsius. Wool uniforms. Women who'd been standing in formation since dawn, waiting for the inspection to begin. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "How long is the ceremony scheduled to run?" "Approximately 90 minutes, Your Majesty. Though with the procession and—" "Make it 45 minutes. The lady-in-waiting blinked. "Ma'am?" "I said 45 minutes. Send word to the commanding officer. We'll shorten the inspection route, eliminate the redundant formations, and conclude by 11 o'clock. Elizabeth's voice carried the peculiar authority of someone who just discovered they possessed power and intended to use it. "But Your Majesty, the schedule has been—" "The schedule," Elizabeth said quietly, "is mine to change. Inform the officer, now." As the lady-in-waiting hurried away, Elizabeth returned to the window. Below, she could see the neat rows of women waiting, their faces indistinguishable at this distance, each one a Helen Carter, each one standing there because tradition demanded it, and no one had the courage to ask why. But Elizabeth remembered something her grandmother had told her years ago, when she was still a young princess, wondering what kind of queen she might become. Power without compassion is tyranny. Compassion without action is cowardice. You must choose every single day which monarch you will be. 45 minutes later, Elizabeth walked onto the parade grounds. The Wadarasi stood at perfect attention, 300 women in formation, their boots polished to mirrors, their uniforms pressed despite the heat. Helen Carter stood in the second row, eyes fixed straight ahead, fighting the panic that rose in her throat every time she locked her knees. The inspection began. Elizabeth walked the first row, her expression serene, nodding at the commanding officer's explanations of unit structure and deployment. Everything proceeded exactly as protocol demanded. Until it didn't. Elizabeth stopped midway through the second row. She turned to the commanding officer, a woman whose chest bore medals from the war and whose face bore the permanent set of someone who'd forgotten how to smile. "Officer, when did these women last have water?" The officer hesitated. "They were permitted refreshment at 600 hours, Your Majesty." 4 hours ago." "Yes, ma'am." Elizabeth looked at the rows of faces, some pale, some flushed, all determinedly blank. "And they'll stand here in this heat, in wool uniforms, for another 40 minutes?" "That is the tradition, ma'am. Soldiers are trained to—" "I didn't ask what soldiers are trained to do. I asked if it's necessary." Elizabeth's voice remained calm, but something in it made the officer stiffen. "The ceremony has always proceeded in this manner, Your Majesty." "Then perhaps," Elizabeth said, loud enough for the nearest rows to hear, "it's time we reconsidered our traditions." She turned to face the formation directly, breaking every rule of royal inspection protocol, which dictated that the monarch should address only officers, never enlisted personnel. "I'm going to ask you something unconventional," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying across the parade ground. "And I want you to answer honestly, without fear of reprimand. Who among you is feeling faint right now? Who's struggling?" Silence. 300 women stood frozen, trained never to respond during inspection, never to break formation, never to admit weakness. "I'm not asking as your queen," Elizabeth continued. "I'm asking as someone who watched a woman collapse at my feet 3 years ago while everyone, including me, walked past her and pretended nothing was wrong. I don't intend to do that again. So I'm asking, who needs to sit down?" More silence. Then, in the third row, a hand slowly rose. Then another, in the back. Then a third, and a fourth. Within 30 seconds, 47 hands were raised. Nearly 16% of the formation. The commanding officer looked horrified. "Your Majesty, this is highly irregular. These women, Elizabeth said, are about to get water and shade. Officer, dismiss those with their hands raised to the tent. The rest will remain in formation. But we'll take a 10-minute break before continuing. And I want water stations set up along the inspection route. If this is going to take 40 more minutes, no one's going to collapse on my watch." "Ma'am, with all respect, this sets a dangerous precedent. If we begin accommodating, good. I hope it sets a precedent. I hope every military inspection from this day forward remembers that we don't sacrifice our people's health for the sake of appearances." Elizabeth turned back to the formation. "Those with hands raised, you're dismissed. The rest of you, at ease for 10 minutes. Drink of water. Sit if you need to. You've already proven your discipline by standing this long in this heat. You don't need to prove it by collapsing." The commanding officer looked like she might faint herself. But she gave the order, and 47 women broke formation and walked, some unsteadily, toward the medical tent. The remaining women relaxed their posture, though most stayed standing, uncertain whether the Queen really meant what she'd said. Helen Carter, who hadn't raised her hand despite the swimming vision at the edges of her sight, finally allowed her knees to unlock. She didn't sit, but she breathed. Elizabeth continued her inspection, but everything had changed. The women stood differently now, still professional, still disciplined, but with something loosened in their shoulders. When the ceremony concluded 40 minutes later, not a single soldier had fainted. In the officer's tent afterward, the commanding officer made one final attempt to register her disapproval. "Your Majesty, I feel compelled to note that what occurred today violated several long-standing military traditions." "Good," Elizabeth said. "Some traditions deserve to be violated. But ma'am, if word of this reaches other units, if they begin to expect such accommodations, then they'll expect to be treated like human beings instead of automatons." How terrible. Elizabeth's tone was mild, but her eyes were steel. "Officer, I understand your concerns, but I watched a woman lie unconscious on the ground while an entire ceremony proceeded around her as if she didn't exist. That was the day I learned that sometimes our traditions are simply cruelty wearing fancy dress. I have no intention of perpetuating that cruelty as Queen." The story spread through the military ranks within days. Not through official channels. There was no formal announcement, no change in written protocol. But women told other women. They wrote letters to friends stationed elsewhere. They whispered in barracks and mess halls. The Queen stopped an inspection. She asked who needed help. She let them sit down. The details varied in the retelling. Some versions made Elizabeth more dramatic, others more quiet. But the core remained constant. The new Queen had broken protocol to acknowledge that the women serving her were human first and soldiers second. Within a month, 3 different commanding officers had quietly implemented water breaks during long ceremonies. They didn't announce it as a change in policy. They simply did it. And when no one fell, when discipline remained strong, when the ceremonies proceeded smoothly, other officers took notice. Within a year, the practice had spread throughout the Warak. Within 5 years, it extended to male units as well. And by the end of the decade, the standing procedures for military ceremonies had been formally revised to include mandatory breaks during extended periods of formation. None of the official documents mentioned Elizabeth's inspection that June morning. The historians who would later write about her early reign focused on bigger moments: her coronation, her Commonwealth tours, her meetings with world leaders. The 47 women who raised their hands that day became a footnote if they were mentioned at all. But Helen Carter remembered, and when she left the military in 1954, finally granted the discharge she'd requested 3 times, she wrote one final letter to the Queen. It was intercepted by palace secretaries, as all correspondence to the monarch was, and Helen never expected a response. She received one anyway. Not from Elizabeth directly, but from a lady-in-waiting, written on palace stationery. "Her Majesty wishes you to know that she remembers the day you fell. She regrets that protocol prevented her from stopping to help. She hopes that her actions since have demonstrated her commitment to ensuring no one else suffers as you did. She wishes you well in your civilian life and thanks you for your service." Helen kept that letter for the rest of her life. It hung framed in her small flat in Manchester, next to a photograph of her in uniform, a reminder that sometimes power listens, even when it shouldn't have to be asked. The photograph from July 1949, the one showing Helen's collapse, Elizabeth walking past, the formation continuing as if nothing was wrong, still exists. It still shows up in history books occasionally, usually captioned as ceremonial perfection or military discipline. But 3 women who served in the WRAC have a different print of that same photograph, passed down through families, with a handwritten note on the back. The handwriting has been analyzed and remains unverified, but the note reads, "This is the moment I learned that tradition without humanity is just organized cruelty. I spent 3 years figuring out how to change it. Small steps where no one was watching. Because revolution doesn't always announce itself. ER." Whether Elizabeth actually wrote those words, whether that photograph annotation is authentic, whether the story of that June inspection happened exactly as the women reported, historians still debate these questions. But every woman who served in the British military after 1952 knows this. Something changed. Protocol bent. Humanity crept in. And it started the day a young queen looked at a formation of suffering women and decided that her grandmother was right. The greatest courage isn't following tradition. It's knowing when to break it. And sometimes, the most powerful act of defiance is simply stopping and asking, who needs help?